Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first event in our monthly Lunch and Learn series. My name is Reba Elliott, and I am the Executive Director here at Cradle Broads for Wilderness. I am sorry for my voice. All of us are so lucky to count on a network of people in Griddle Broads for Wilderness who love public lands and who devote all of their expertise and time and energy to protecting these beautiful wild places. This Lunch and Learn series is a way to showcase all of the expertise our members have to inform our wider network. And we would love to hear from you if you have something that you'd like to share about Boundary Waters, Border Wall, Lower Snake River Dam, whatever is of interest to you. If you have an idea for an upcoming event, please share it. There is a form in the chat. You can find the chat if you hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little button come up that says chat. So click on that chat button and you will see the link. Please submit your ideas. We would love to hear them. Today's Lunch and Learn event is presented by our dear, wonderful friend, Ken Straley. Ken is a retired wilderness specialist with the U.S. Forest Service, and his presentation on Wild by Law, the Wilderness Act of 1964, will help us understand the background on this law and how it's being interpreted today. Ken is joined by our great friend Taylor. Taylor is a former Wilderness, Wild, and Scenic Rivers Program Manager at the U.S. Forest Service. And both Ken and Taylor help lead a group here called FLAAG, which is the former Land Agency Affinity Group. FLAAG helped bring this presentation to life. So I will hand it over to Taylor, who will take us forward from here.
All right, thanks so much, Reba. And Reba just shared with you what the FLAAG is. And I just will say that the idea was first sparked by Great Old Broads for Wilderness when their staff reached out to the mailing list to find retired federal agency people who wanted to continue working for public lands and wilderness post-retirement. Since then, we know there have been a lot of changes in our world and a lot of people who have been separated from their work much too soon, not always voluntarily or with an option to retire. So the FLAAG concept has expanded to welcome all who left their work in public lands, whether it was voluntary or not, and whenever it was. The intent is to offer a variety of ways for people to participate and contribute the knowledge and skills built over years in public land management to the protection of wilderness and to help uphold the values of public lands across the country. So please stay tuned for more to come about future FLAAG events that we are building as we speak. And now I'll turn it over to Ken.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wild by Law, not to be confused with the 1991 documentary film of the same name, which I highly recommend, by the way, if you haven't seen it. My name is Ken Straley. I am a retired wilderness specialist, mostly with a career with Forest Service, a little bit with BLM, 32 years, just wrapped it up recently and have been looking to get into some good trouble, to quote John Lewis. And so thank you to Great Old Broads for providing me the opportunity to do that. We're going to spend about the next 40 minutes reviewing the Wilderness Act of 1964. This 61-year-old piece of legislation still provides the foundational guidance for pretty much anybody working in wilderness advocacy or stewardship, including the agencies themselves. So it pays to know what the law says, what it means, how the agencies are interpreting it, and that's why we're here today. It's a lot of content. We'll try to go through it briefly, but for those that really want to do a deeper dive, I suggest checking out Wilderness Connect, which is actually at wilderness.net, and you can learn a lot more there. There's even another course available on the Wilderness Act of 1964. Because our time is short, we're not going to take any live discussion as we move, but if you'll put your questions in the chat window, Taylor will address those as we go. We're going to start with a brief look at the wilderness movement, the history surrounding the wilderness movement leading up to the Wilderness Act itself, just so that we understand the context. Then we're going to look at each section of the Wilderness Act that really relates to stewardship or advocacy work, the work that you all do. This law, I think, has been posted. Yes, been posted in the chat. I'm not sure. Taylor, did we get that in the chat or somewhere?
I will get it in there right now.
Okay, so you all have a copy of this or will have a copy of this. It's only 8 pages long. It's a very short law, but it packs a punch. You're all familiar with your American history. Suffice to say that in the 19th century, we had entered the era of manifest destiny. And I'm sorry if you don't remember this from your civics class, but manifest destiny held that we were preordained to expand from coast to coast and fill in all these nasty blank spaces on the map. Nature abhors a vacuum, and apparently so do we. I would say we did that pretty effectively. Early in the 20th century, between expanding settlement, industrialization, and in particular the advent of the automobile, we were consuming natural resources and the land itself at an astonishing rate. People began to worry that we were losing too much of our natural heritage. This was really the beginning of the end for our wildlands, but it was also the beginning of a movement to save what remained. Coincidentally, for you nerds in the room, check out the book Driven Wild by Dr. Sutter, Paul Sutter, who's an environmental historian at CU Boulder. Fantastic read, and it's all about the influence of the automobile on the wilderness movement. By the 1950s, public lands were primarily seen as a source of natural resources, lumber, timber, water, power, all the things that we needed to fuel that industrial juggernaut that was and still is Western civilization. But within just 100 years, we had altered the landscape in ways probably not thought possible by earlier generations of Americans. Galvanized by catastrophic losses of precious places, declining environmental quality, and a growing interest in preserving something of ourselves, something of our natural history, the wilderness movement went mainstream in this era. All movements give rise to heroes. Arthur Carhart is arguably the first hero of the wilderness movement, often an unsung hero, which is why I like to include him in these presentations. He's credited for being the first person to suggest land management for purposes other than development, or the first Fed anyway to suggest that. And his story is really short. He was the first landscape architect in the Forest Service. They called them recreation engineers at the time. He was sent to Trappers Lake, Colorado on what is now the White River National Forest and directed to survey for summer homes and roads. The area was to be developed. And he returned from that mission and reported that the area really not ought to be developed. It ought to be saved in its natural state. He wrote a 4-page memo about this to his buddy Aldo Leopold. That name should sound familiar. And that memo became the first federal document to suggest some sort of wilderness preservation concept. It wasn't long before Carhart was joined by other courageous visionaries, including these folks, and I'm sure you know these names well, and there were many others, under the banner of the Wilderness Society, ostensibly to establish some sort of permanent protection for remaining wildlands. That was their goal. Aldo Leopold and Bob Marshall co-founded the Wilderness Society in 1935. And Howard Zahniser came along a little later, first as the executive secretary, later as the executive director, and he became the champion for the Wilderness Society all the way up through 1964 when he died, unfortunately, just weeks before the act passed Congress. So he never got to see it passed. But he was the primary architect of the Wilderness Act. And the words that you're going to read, and I'm going to show you here, are his words. By the way, that's worth learning more about these guys too. They're really fascinating characters. Back to Wild by Law. Check it out, seriously. You ought to be able to Google that and find it. Finally, after 3 decades of lobbying by the Wilderness Society, 8 years of debate in Congress, the first act was introduced in 1956, the first bill. 66 different drafts of the Wilderness Bill were written, largely by Zahniser. 18 public hearings and 6,000 pages of testimony. After passing the Senate a second time, July 30th, 1964, the bill finally passed the House as the Wilderness Act. There was only one dissenting vote in the House, coincidentally. I'd love to ask people who knows who it was, but we won't go there. This is the formal title of the act, by the way, to establish a national wilderness preservation system for the permanent good of the whole people and for other purposes. Section 1 of the Wilderness Act retitles it simply to the Wilderness Act. I love these old pictures. President Johnson signing the act. September 3rd, 1964, passed it into law. Some of you might recognize the characters in the picture here. Obviously, those co-sponsors of the bill are all here, Stewart and Udall and others. But you may not notice, or maybe you did, the woman in the dark hair there, that's Alice Sonnheiser, the widow of Sonnheiser. And Marty Murray, who was a conservation legend in her own right. She's here as well. All right, so what did Congress intend with this piece of legislation? This is really an amazing work, arguably a work of art for Congress, which is saying something. In short, Congress intended that we not occupy and modify everything in the United States, that we leave something in its natural state. That's how the statement of policy begins, at least. There's more to it, though, that maybe is more important. This is regarded as the primary intent. The purpose of the Wilderness Act is to secure the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. This recognizes that there are real human benefits to wilderness preservation. We don't preserve wilderness for its own sake. I wish we did, but I'm sorry, we're just not that noble a species. We preserve wilderness because we recognize that there are real benefits. So this might translate into advocacy work, right? Because we're not really preserving this concept of wilderness as much as we are preserving the benefits that wilderness produces for us. And if we focus on those benefits, we might be more effective at reaching different audiences. The act wasn't intended to be the end of the wilderness movement at all. In fact, it established a national wilderness preservation system and provided some direction for expanding the system. Section 3 of the act does exactly that. The first part of Section 3 talks about the original designations, basically all national forest lands at the time that were classified as wilderness, wild, or canoe. These are administrative designations. All of those lands were immediately designated wilderness by virtue of the act itself. And that was 54 areas and about 9.1 million acres. Section 3 goes on to talk about how some things could be added to the system. So it says national forests ought to look at all areas classified as primitive at the time. Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service were directed to look at their roadless areas 5,000 acres or more and determine their suitability. Those agencies were then to make recommendations to the president, and then the president would advise Congress, and Congress would decide whether to designate or not. And that's how the system was intended to grow. The interesting thing is, from 1972 forward, most new wilderness designations did not happen by this process. They happened because they were citizen driven. It was advocacy work, like the work you all do, that got most of those designations. So what happened in 1972? What's the big deal? The scapegoat wilderness was designated in 1972, and it was the first citizen-driven wilderness designation. The Forest Service hadn't even recommended that for wilderness designation. That was entirely homegrown, grassroots, citizen-driven work. So what do we have? We started with 9.1 million acres, 54 wilderness areas, all Forest Service in the beginning. As of last year, it's actually current this year too. I should have changed the date on that. We have almost 112 million acres, 806 areas managed by all 4 agencies. You might recall the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Park Service were all included in the Wilderness Act itself. The BLM came along with the passage of FLPMA in 1976 and are now a wilderness managing agency also. So all 4 of these agencies manage wilderness. Looks like a lot of land, right? Not really. It's about 5% is all of the entire US land base. It is about 20% of our federal public lands, and that's probably an important number to know. So it's an important part of the job for land management agencies. It is 20% of their portfolio. These wilderness areas range in size considerably. The largest one is Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska. and 9.1 million acres. Just coincidentally happens to be the same size as the entire system was in 1964. The smallest one is Pelican Island, 5.5 acres off the coast of Florida. Actually, it's 3 acres now because they've lost some land due to boat-induced wave action and rising sea levels. And I think we're going to see more of that. But, Congress gets to decide how big is big enough, and they figured they could protect wilderness values on an island of 5.5 acres. This is still going on. We're still seeing new designations, even though I wonder how much land is left that is suitable. But as recently as 2023, with the National Defense Authorization Act, we had 3 new wilderness areas designated in Nevada. So this work is still going on. Do we have enough? It's a rhetorical question, right? Everybody's going to have a different answer to this, probably, although I suspect this group has a bias one direction. This is a road density map. It's a little dated already, 10 years old. And bear in mind that we build 14,000 new miles of road every year in the US. So these darker areas where the road density is lower, these are being slowly filled in. We have about 4.2 million miles of road in the US, which is enough to circle the Earth 165 times. So do we have enough? I'll leave you there. All right, so we've got 112 million acres of this thing called wilderness. Maybe we ought to talk about what the heck that is. It is really one of the most misunderstood land management paradigms there is. People define this in different ways. To some people, wilderness is the little woodland area in their backyard. To other people, it's a state park. To some people, it's an Alaskan wilderness and everything in between, right? And this was probably true in 1964. So Congress did provide us with the definition. There's several parts to this, but the definition begins with this word contrast, which I can't emphasize enough. The point is wilderness is different than other lands, other public lands, and it has to be managed differently to maintain this contrast. If we lose contrast, if we dummy it down, if we dilute it, we lose wilderness. We lose what makes it important. We lose what distinguishes it from other lands. It becomes like everything else. Okay, there's a 6-part definition that follows, and I provided some emphasis on some words that I want you to try to hold on to, because these words are going to become more important later and are going to haunt you for the rest of your time as wilderness advocates and stewards. I promise. Wilderness is untrammeled. This is one of Sennheiser's words. So what the heck is untrammeled? People think that means untrampled. It's not the same thing. A trammel is a net or a restraint. So untrammeled then is unrestrained, right? Free-willed. This is a defining feature of wilderness, according to Sennheiser. He felt like it was the most important feature of wilderness. The law doesn't support that, though. Be careful. But there are still those in the wilderness community that feel like this is the single most important defining feature of wilderness, that it is unrestrained, it is free-willed, humans aren't mucking about manipulating it. And by the way, you'll see the word wild used sometimes as a synonym for this. It's untrammeled puts the wild in wilderness, you might say.
It is.
Sorry? Okay. Moving on to undeveloped. This one's pretty intuitive, right? We're not building stuff on it or leaving stuff out there. It's undeveloped. I love this one. This one really refers to natural condition, but look at the qualifiers on here. Look at the adverbs. Generally, substantially, primarily. So why would Congress have done that? This is really important to understand as wilderness advocates. There is not an acre of land or water on the planet that is still pristine, if you define pristine as not being influenced by modern humans. Nothing left on the planet is pristine. That was true in 1964, too. This seems to recognize that, and wilderness does not have to be pristine to be defined as wilderness. Natural conditions do have to be predominant. The bar is very high, don't get me wrong, but it does not have to be pristine. Nothing is pristine or ever will be ever again. That's just the reality we have to deal with. But how natural is it? That's really the question here. And I love this one too. Wilderness is the only place where visitors are promised by law the opportunity to experience this. That's really unique, don't you think? Solitude, the maximum separation from modern human civilization and evidence of it. or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. Risk, challenge, self-reliance, freedom, and other values associated with these wildlands. Um, the recreation is literally part of the definition of wilderness. But be careful. Wilderness is not just a recreation resource. There are an awful lot of managers that try to manage it like one, and we need to be vigilant about that. It is not just a recreation resource, but recreation is a part of wilderness. And it has to be of sufficient size, basically, so that it can be managed as wilderness. Well, what the heck is that? Well, Congress gets to decide what it is, so there's really no point in delving into that any deeper. You know, Pelican Island, 5.5 acres. Congress felt like that could be managed as wilderness. And we have Wrangell St. Elias at 9.1 million and everything in between. So this one doesn't really count for much. But this one does. This is the only part of the definition that is conditional. Notice the word may on here. This is a law and words matter. May contain ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historical value. This recognizes that wilderness areas may have features within them that are unique and help define the place as something special, something different. And this is really common in wilderness areas that are actually named after a particular feature, you know, like Shining Rock Wilderness in North Carolina, for example. Well, it's named after Shining Rock, so that's probably one of those other features of value. Sometimes there are cultural resources in wilderness that help define the wilderness, and those become these other features of value.
Ken may have popped off real quick, but I know he'll come back on.
Yeah, we had this little tech difficulty earlier, unfortunately.
While we're waiting for Ken, oh, he's back. Sorry.
Ken, do you have sound?
Or perhaps he's not. Um, I wonder whether while we're waiting for Ken, Taylor, do you feel okay to answer maybe that question that was in the chat?
I'm gonna have to have Ken go back to his exact stat. That's why I said we'd follow up. Sorry.
Okay, we can certainly keep waiting for Ken as Taylor and oh, I can turn my video off on. I had it off earlier to not be distracting, but hello everyone again. If you missed it, my name is Reba, and I'm grateful to work for Great Old Broads for Wilderness. We had a technical issue earlier. Ken's internet cut out a little bit earlier, and we were hoping it wouldn't happen again, but the internet gremlins may be messing with us a little bit. So while Ken is gone, I'm not sure whether Taylor or Julie, one of you, is. I think we have the slideshow. I know that Ken developed this and is the leader of it. But I just wanted to check and see whether it's possible for Julie or Taylor, really. Do you feel comfortable leading for a couple of minutes while Ken's internet comes back?
I don't really, not really, but I can maybe speak to a couple of things that we were going to do at the end, real quick.
He
And then
says
if
he
we have
can't
to, I can,
unmute.
I'm sorry.
Ken says he can't unmute.
Thank you for that.
Oh, I see that now.
I actually don't even. Julie, are you able to see Ken in the?
Whoever's the administrator can unmute people.
I can only ask them to unmute themselves, which I've tried doing. Ken, you there?
Sometimes exiting out and then coming back in can be helpful.
That's what I was just gonna say. If he goes out and comes back in, he should be able to come back in. and unmute.
And I would, if Ken, if you're here, maybe if you could join by your phone, if that's an option for you, maybe it would help with the microphone and the internet. But in the meantime, yeah, I think, and Ken, please feel free to type in the chat. We're getting those messages in the chat. So please feel free to type if that's useful.
I suspect he dropped off and is coming back in.
Ken, are you able to speak now, or? We're going to send a message to you, Ken. You may already be seeing it asking you to unmute. Yes, I think you're good now.
I think I'm unmuted now. Can you
Yes,
hear me?
perfect. Yeah,
Oh,
awesome.
geez. I don't know what the heck is going on here, everyone. I'm sorry about that. Let me see if I can pick up where we left off.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. And Ken, no worries. We all know all too well how these computers will play tricks on us, so no worries. And thanks, everyone, for your patience.
See if I can get us where we were. I think I know where we were. Not the first time this has happened, but apologies. Okay, I think that's where we were. Does that look right?
Right there. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, hopefully that doesn't happen again. So, what exactly are the agency's responsibilities for these places? And this is important that we know this, right? Because part of our jobs as wilderness stewards and wilderness advocates is to hold their feet to the fire. This is the first place that we get any hint of that. Section 2A talks about preserving their wilderness character. It talks about, use for the use and enjoyment of people, yada, 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 but it also says, and so as to leave them unimpaired. And it talks about the preservation of wilderness character. Now, in case you're not convinced that that's very compelling, Section 4B expands on that quite a lot and is quite explicit and says twice, not once, but twice, that this is the agency's job, in addition to all of its other jobs. So preserving wilderness character is regarded as the primary mandate of the Wilderness Act, first and foremost above any other mandate in the Act. In case you're not convinced, there's a tremendous body of case law on this. And I'll get to this in a second, but some of that case law has been analyzed and the conclusions are really interesting. When the plaintiffs claim an agency protects wilderness too much, the agency wins 90% of the time. When plaintiffs claim the agency protects wilderness too little, they win only 46% of the time. So if you're a decision maker working for an agency, you really want to lean heavily towards protection because you stand twice the chance of winning in court. Pretty much all case law, in fact, I can't think of any exceptions to this, confirms agency responsibility for preserving wilderness character. These conclusions came out of a study from 2010 that included 287 cases, but there have been cases since then, lots of them. In fact, the most recent one is probably from last October. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's worth mentioning. District Judge Malloy ruled against a project to poison with rotenone 45 miles of stream Buffalo Creek in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness last October, which ostensibly was intended to expand Yellowstone trout populations. And that was challenged, shot down, and the judge said, let's see if what is the quote here from that even? The decision was really worth reading, actually, and that can be made available to any of you who are really interested. He said, it degrades wilderness character on every level. That was in the decision. That's a quote. And it's a great decision to read. Okay, let's operationalize this a little bit. So when a wilderness is designated, its wilderness character falls somewhere on this continuum. The lower right is like Walmart's parking lot, okay? And the upper left is pristine, and we've established there's no such thing as pristine. Pristine doesn't exist. So your wilderness exists somewhere on this continuum at the time of designation. Well, the law says preserve wilderness character. So the way this is literally interpreted is that X can't move down the line. It's that simple. You cannot allow it to degrade, okay, from whatever it was at the time of designation. What about making it better? Well, the law doesn't seem to require us to make it better. I would argue there's an ethical responsibility with the agencies to take advantage of any opportunity to do that they can find, but they're not required to do that. With one exception, when an area is designated, agencies have to discontinue any of the prohibited uses that might be going on inside of that wilderness at the time of designation, which of course statutorily improves its wilderness character. Can't go down the line. Make it really clear. This is good. This is bad. Everybody on board? Okay. Don't let this happen. This is what happens when wilderness is neglected, either because agencies don't have the resources to do the job, maybe they don't have the will to do the job, maybe they don't notice what's going on out there. I think that happens a lot. This is looking at wilderness character being degraded through a recreation lens, but there are other ways to look at this too. As a frequent visitor myself, this drives me crazy. When Congress designates a 100,000 acre wilderness, they don't mean to say you can ruin 80% of that as long as you hold on to the back 40. That's not what they mean. As soon as you cross that line, you've entered wilderness. There are no buffer zones on the outside. There are no buffer zones on the inside. That's a tough paradigm to manage. So you've got to give it to the managers, but that is what the law says. Okay, we keep talking about wilderness character. We should probably let you know what the heck it is. The law does not define it. So we're a little handicapped here, right? But a very smart group of wilderness specialists spent years and years, led by some folks at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, to figure out what this was, how to measure it, how to monitor it, how to define it. You guys see something weird on my screen? That line came out of nowhere.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's okay.
Maybe I should go faster. Okay. So here's what keeping it wild, okay, and the document those folks produced, I'm sorry I didn't finish that thought, resulted in Keeping It Wild 2, which was published in 2015 and adopted by all 4 of the federal land management agencies. And Taylor is making that available to you in the chat window also. Keeping It Wild 2, for those of you that want to do a deeper dive, really defines wilderness character and explains how it's to be measured, how it's to be monitored, how the agencies will be held accountable for this primary mandate of the Wilderness Act. So Keeping It Wild 2 does recognize that wilderness character is this holistic combination of values from the biophysical environment, symbolic meaning, personal experience. A lot of these are intangible, some of them are tangible, but it's this holistic idea that wilderness character is all of these things. Well, the agencies can't be expected to manage personal experience or symbolic meaning. Those are intangible personal values, but they can manage the biophysical environment, the setting, and that's really what agencies focus on, and that's what they ought to focus on, and that's what we ought to focus on when we're working with agencies, because the thinking is that these other values, these intangible values, depend on the setting. If you don't have the setting, you can't have the other things. These words look familiar? Yeah, they ought to. They're right out of Section 2C, the definition of wilderness from the Act. These wound up being what we call the 5 qualities of wilderness character. It's right from the definition. So it should be easy to remember. But these are the things that are being defined, measured, actively managed by the agencies. And they're accountable for these things. This is what wilderness character is. Okay. And remember, other features of value is that only one that's conditional. You may have other features of value, but you have to have untrammeled, natural, undeveloped, and outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. Those first 4 are statutorily required everywhere. Okay, let's go back to the language of law for a minute. Within and supplemental, this language tends to trip up, especially the Fish and Wildlife Service. This was essentially repeated in Section 4B, and we looked at that when we looked at the mandate to preserve wilderness character. It talked about, regardless of what your other purposes are, you also have to preserve wilderness character now if you have wilderness. That's kind of what this says. Whatever your organic legislation is, your enabling legislation, your mission statements, any of that stuff that comes out of Congress, You now also have to manage wilderness.
Oh, I think we lost Ken again.
It appears that the gremlins have indeed struck again.
Yes.
While we wait for Ken to come back, and I'm so sorry again, everyone. Ken apparently has not had this problem with his computer until today. So we're as excited as everyone else. This wild ride of Ken's internet, but it hadn't happened previous to today. So sorry about that. Ken should be back very shortly. And maybe Taylor, if he has to leave again, if the internet stops working again, then maybe those few things for the end would be good.
Yeah, because I see Anne, you have your hand up.
I think Ken is just returning. I think I just saw
Oh,
him.
you're on mute, Anne. Okay. You're on mute, Anne.
And you're on mute. Do you want
Okay,
to?
I'm
Oh,
unmuted now, right? I'm sorry,
you are.
folks.
No
Yeah.
worries.
It's
Please go
funny,
ahead.
we even tested this technology to make sure this wasn't going to
We
happen,
did.
but naturally it did, because it does. Okay, I think this is where we were, yeah? Okay, good deal. Within and supplemental. So to cut to the chase here, all laws are equal unless there's another law that says they're not. That's really how you translate this. So Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service especially will sometimes say, but our enabling legislation says we're supposed to do this. Yeah, and now you've got wilderness and you're also supposed to do that. You have to honor both of those laws, and the job of the manager is to figure out how to reconcile any conflicts. And of course, I cannot advance the slide. Okay. Let me fuss with this for a second, folks. Again, so sorry.
We need
This
to.
used to happen all the time when I was using a government computer, and I used to blame it on the computer, but now who do I blame it on?
Yeah,
Do you think it would help at all if we turned off our video to conserve bandwidth or whatever?
I have no idea if that has anything to do with anything. It wouldn't hurt.
Ken, I'll pull up the presentation too, and just in case I can try sharing too.
Are we back?
Yes.
Oh, geez, maybe I had to go faster. Okay, Section 4B talks about the public purposes of wilderness. These are the uses of wilderness that Congress said were appropriate. Be careful here. A lot of people use this as justification to do things that they ought not to be trying to do in wilderness. So the take-home message, looking at the broader context of the law and the central mandate of the law, is that these are the appropriate uses of wilderness as long as they are consistent with the preservation of wilderness character. First and foremost, they must be consistent with the preservation of wilderness character. Okay. Congress explicitly prohibited a number of things to happen in wilderness because they directly degrade wilderness character. They make it very easy for us to occupy and modify. Remember that language? So they are explicitly prohibited. It doesn't say there shall be no new things like this. It doesn't say there shall be no significant things like this. It says there shall be none of these things. Commercial enterprises, permanent roads, temporary roads, use of motor vehicles, motorized equipment, motorboats, landing of aircraft, mechanical transport, structure or installation. Section 4C. This is really the crux of wilderness stewardship, especially for managers. And it's where agencies, I think, most often go afoul of the act. So this is something for us to really watch closely. There are exceptions, right? There are always exceptions. 4 of them. The first one is except as specifically provided in this act. So if there is a special provision in the law that allows something, then you must allow something. And we're going to get to those in a moment if I don't run out of time first. Subject to existing private rights. Sometimes, and there are private rights that exist inside wilderness areas, and we do honor those, and nobody gives up anything when a wilderness is designated. But in honoring those rights, sometimes we have to allow those prohibited uses. And then other provisions of law, because Congress can always trump Congress. They do it all the time. I could give you a long list of examples of that. And there's one more. This is the one agency managers spend a lot of time with, except as necessary to meet minimum requirements for the administration of the area for the purpose of this act. That all of that language is very important. So important that the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center built 3 courses around this, and they include this in every single one of their trainings. So, and we could do a later session, not just on this topic, and it might help people understand what this means. But in a nutshell, if something passes muster as the minimum requirement for the administration of the area for the purpose of this act, managers can exempt 8 out of the 10 prohibited uses through a process called the minimum requirements analysis. And some of you have heard the term MRDG, minimum requirement decision guide, or maybe the more recent version of that, now called an MRAF, minimum requirement analysis framework. Those are just tools for doing this analysis. Okay, so what are those exceptions, those special provisions, rather, those concessions that were made in the act in order to get it passed? Remember, 66 drafts. You don't get through 66 drafts without making some compromises, and that's really what these are. The first one is aircraft and motorboats. To the extent those uses were established at the time of designation, they're allowed to continue. And we have examples of wilderness areas where one or both of those things are allowed to continue. Fire, insect, and disease. To the extent that such measures may be taken as may be necessary, that's a quote, such measures may be taken as may be necessary to control fire, insects, and disease in wilderness. That is not the blank check it sounds like it is. For those of you that are familiar with the MRA process, that basically gives agencies a pass on step 1, but not on step 2. Mining and prospecting. I kind of write that one off because as of December 31st, 1983, wilderness areas were withdrawn from mineral entry, and any valid mining claims were not granted surface occupancy after that. So kind of becomes irrelevant for the most part. There are some active mining claims in wilderness that are still protected as a valid existing right, but there can be no new ones. Oops. Water and power projects. The president, curiously only the president, can authorize water and power developments on national forest wilderness areas if he or she chooses to do that. Thankfully, that power has not been exercised to date. Commercial grazing. That is the only special provision that is compulsory. It actually says commercial grazing shall, not may, shall be allowed to continue wherever it has been established prior to designation. It's subject to conditions. There's these things called the Congressional Grazing Guidelines that govern how that work is to happen and under what conditions changes can be made, but it shall be allowed to continue. Boundary waters, canoe area, wilderness. The original act had a provision in here that said timber activities be allowed to continue, including the roads and other things that go along with it, motorboats, some other things. In fact, it wasn't really wilderness at all. So in 1978, that was amended out of the act. And in fact, the boundary waters even got control of their airspace. After that, it's the only Forest Service wilderness area with control of its airspace. Really interesting story there. Commercial services. So commercial services are permitted to the extent necessary for realizing wilderness purposes. Slightly different language than I read you from section 4C. We could have a whole course on that too. But this is where outfitter guides come from, if they pass an extent necessary determination. Water rights and wildlife jurisdictions. I've written those off because the act is agnostic on those two things. It actually bothers to say this act has no bearing on these things. So whatever law and policy and your understanding of those things is regarding water rights and wildlife jurisdictions, they are unchanged by the Wilderness Act. There's a pile of case law on wildlife, and we could do a course on that too, make that available to you another time. But The act has no bearing on it. There are three other sections of the act, but we don't need to talk about those at all. Section 5 talks about inholdings. Section 6 is about contributions, gifts of land and money and other things. Section 7 was actually terminated in 2000 because it's just congressional reporting. And I guess they decided they didn't need to keep doing that. And I'll leave you with this last thought from Howard Zahniser. It sort of encapsulates the purpose and intent of the act, the essence of the act. We must see that an adequate system of wilderness areas is designated for preservation, and then we must allow nothing to alter the wilderness character of the preserves. And that's the essence of it. Thanks everybody for your attention. I think I'm about out of time due to the glitches. I trust Taylor was able to address questions, but if we didn't get to any during the session, we'll do follow-up afterwards. Thank you everybody for participating and for your patience with our glitches. I hope you got something out of it. Keep it wild. Taylor, it's all you.
Thanks, Ken. Since we were a little short on time, I just put basically what I was going to say about the FLAAG. And if you're interested in learning more and getting in touch with us, there's an email. And we do have a couple of questions we'll follow up on the Fix Our Forests Act. And yeah, I'll talk to Ken about that afterwards. So I'm going to turn it over to Reba. Thanks, Ken.
Yes, thank you, Ken. That was really, really informative and even heroic with all those glitches that you just kept your train of thought going. Really, really impressive and much appreciated. We are so, so grateful for people like Ken and Taylor who are able to share their expertise with everyone. Taylor, as she said, has just put an email address for the former land agency affinity group is there in the chat. So please contact Taylor and Ken and all of their friends to hook up with that group if you're a former agency employee. And there's another link there if you have ideas for other lunch and learn sessions. We want them very much. We really, really want to be able to take advantage of all of the brilliant people who are in our network. It's just great to be able to build on everything you know so well. So there's a form there in the chat if you'd like to suggest another idea for a lunch and learn session. Someone was asking earlier in the chat, what can we do about all of the threats to wilderness? Many of us are rightfully so upset by some of those threats. A lot of us are aware of this initiative to scrap the roadless rule, which has protected wilderness areas from rampant road building and timber harvesting for 25 years. And as someone mentioned, the rescission of the roadless rule is not the only proposal underway. And there's a kind of consistent theme. There's a theme of changes in policy that benefit big business. I'm just going to list a couple of them. I think that we're all aware, but when you hear them all together, it's just very clear that there's this playbook to put public lands to the benefit of a few private corporations. So rolling back the roadless rule would allow for timber sales, and that could benefit timber companies like Weyerhaeuser, one of the biggest timber companies in the country. Just this December last month, Senator Mike Lee added an amendment to the appropriations bill for the Department of the Interior. There was language in that bill that would prevent the sale of national parks and other protected lands to private companies. Senator Mike Lee added an amendment that said, no, actually reverse. We can sell all these beautiful places to private companies. That would benefit tourism companies like Disney. Yellowstone, brought to you by Disney. You can imagine the kind of horrors of something like that. There's a very misleadingly named Borderlands Conservation Act that would allow the Secretary of Homeland Security to build tactical infrastructure um, to combat immigration on wilderness land. That would benefit immigration detention companies like the GEO Group, which is one of the biggest private companies building these detention facilities. The Congressional Review Act is being used to overturn the decades-long ban on copper mining in the headwaters of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which is, by the way, the most visited wilderness in the country. Overturning that ban through this kind of very tricky workaround using the Congressional Review Act, that could benefit Twin Metals Minnesota. Twin Metals Minnesota is a subsidiary of a Chilean copper mining company. And finally, that same Congressional Review Act, tricky theme, is being used for Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. That could open it up to oil and gas leases that would benefit companies like ExxonMobil. I was talking to a friend the other day. Do you guys remember the old shows where someone would wear like a Groucho Marx disguise with the glasses and the mustache, and then the glasses come off and you think, oh, I knew who you were all along. That was a silly disguise. This is that Groucho Marx disguise over and over again. They keep putting on the different glasses, but we see behind there is the same person over and over. It's a play to put public lands into the pocketbooks of a couple of big corporations. One of the most effective things that we can do is to make sure that people who are not here in this Zoom call know what's happening. We need to help everybody see that little Groucho Marx disguise. So I am going to put into the chat a link to a Facebook post. If you have Facebook, if you would please click on that link. I'll give you a second to click on it. And what we're asking you to do is to please like it or share it. That's the way that all of the people in your community can start seeing that there's a playbook being used here. It might seem like a small thing, but last summer there was a big outcry against the public lands sell-off. And that big outcry is what stopped that sell-off. So liking that post, sharing that post right there in the chat, it's one way to make sure that people can see what is being done in their names to these lands that we all care about. So thank you very much. If you're able to click on that link, thank you for liking, thank you for sharing, thank you for helping spread the word. It really makes a difference and it's much appreciated. We will be back next month. This is a monthly Lunch and Learn series. We'll be back next month with more information about advocacy issues, things that are going on in our country. Please submit your ideas. We would love to hear from you. We would love to feature you soon. And I just want to thank again, first of all, everyone who's here. You had a choice for what to do, and yay you! Thank you for coming. It's awesome and amazing to see everybody caring and contributing their time, and just golly, there's 69 people and one really cute cat here. So we have 70 living beings that are pro-wilderness, which is awesome. And we will see you next month for the next one in this series. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you to the FLAAG group. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye.